So when we left off yesterday, or when my computer stopped functioning, we were talking about the differences between monopolistic competition and oligopoly. So we talked a little bit about advertising and the fact that the ads for monopolistic competition tend to feature brand names, distinguishing features, differentiation, while in oligopoly, they name the competitors. So if you see an ad, for example, for Ford comparing itself to Toyota, or for Southwest Airlines comparing itself to Delta, those kinds of ads, or of course cell phone companies do that a lot, compare themselves, their coverage map, that kind of thing. Those types of advertising indicate that it would be an oligopoly. So I don't believe we talked about long-run economic profits. In monopolistic competition, as we saw in the graph yesterday, long-run economic profits would be unlikely because at long-run equilibrium, the demand curve, the price, is going to be at a tangent to the ATC curve. So in the long run, when the adjustments have all been made, firms have entered, firms have exited, there would be no economic profit to the monopolistic competitor, just normal profit. In oligopoly, it's much more likely that there would be long-run economic profits because it's a lot harder for competitors to enter the industry because there's much higher barriers to entry. And then I think I was about to talk about the water bottle differentiation activity. This basically what I do with students is I talk about the fact that water is basically, for all practical purposes, a commodity item. There is, of course, bubbly or gas water as opposed to flat water, but flat H2O that comes out of the tap, when I was a kid, and probably when you were kids, was pretty much just a commodity item that you could actually just drink out of a drinking fountain. It was the same no matter where it was, or out of a tap, assuming that you had clean water. And I guess taking out the factor of well water or water that tastes like minerals. So I talk about the fact that, in right around the 1980s, some firms started introducing bottled water and trying to sell it as like an upscale good, and give them a little bit of background on that. And then the assignment is for them, they each get a water bottle. It could be just like Target water or something. Sometimes I tear off the label, sometimes I don't. But the point is, they get paper and they get markers and they get tape or glue, and they need to make their own brand of bottled water, and they need to convince the class that their brand of water is the best. And they make a little advertisement. And so each group does a little speech, and we vote on them and determine who did the best job of differentiating water. So it just helps get that point across about what product differentiation looks like in monopolistic competition when you're trying to be able to try to eke out profit, at least temporarily, on a commodity good. All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which was about graphing oligopoly. This is not something that I teach. The College Board and the AP curriculum does not use the kinked demand curve at all. The focus is strictly on game theory. So, I can explain this, but I can't really tell you how to teach it because I've never actually really taught it to students. So the main point about the kinked demand curve is that there's two different elasticities at work here. There's the elasticity at work if you, as the oligopolist, raise your prices, and there's the elasticity at work if you lower your prices. So the current price, the existing price, which is right here, is really that sweet spot in the market. That's where you're at right now. And the theory is, if you lower your prices, you lower your prices thinking, I'm going to be able to increase revenue, people are going to come running to me. And the problem is that if you lower your prices, so does everyone else. So what happens is you don't really gain a lot of quantity. You can see that's fairly inelastic. You lower the prices and you're just going to lose. Now you're just going to lose money because everyone else is going to do it. Now everybody's losing money. And this, of course, is where airfare wars led the airlines to. If you raise your price, on the other hand, your competitors are going to look at you and say, I don't know why you did that. And they're just going to stay where they are, which means you're going to lose quantity and fast. So if you raise your price, right, the slightest price increase is going to cause a huge drop in quantity, right? A similar sized price decrease is not going to cause a very large increase in quantity. So you really just have an incentive to stay where you are. All right, so let's talk about what we actually do with oligopoly, and that is this idea of game theory. So I will walk you through this, and then we can meet a little bit early on Monday if we want to review this again. So game theory is the idea that we can analyze oligopoly behavior by looking at the competitors as if they are engaged essentially in a game. And so there's three elements to looking at this game. There's the players, and in this case, Pepsi and Coke are the two players. there's the strategies available to each player. And this is a very simple payoff matrix, and it's all that we do in AP, or I believe in CIS. So you don't need to, but there are, just to let you know, there are more complex matrices. There are repeating games, and there are 3x3 games, but we don't need to do those at this level of economics. So each in a simple matrix like this, each player is going to have two strategies: advertise or don't advertise. And then the payoffs are what goes in here. Okay, so the payoffs are the numbers in the matrix, and they tell us the payoff each player receives depending on what is chosen. So if you go to this top square here, you see this is where Pepsi has chosen advertise and Coke has chosen advertise, and we can see that Pepsi is going to get 80 in, say, profits. I don't know if it's $80 million, $80,000. We're just saying 80 units. And Coke will also get 80. If we look down here, we can see that Pepsi would get 100 if they don't advertise and Coke doesn't advertise. Pepsi will get 100 and Coke will get 100. So this would seem to be the place where they'd want to be, is neither firm advertises. But we know that's not what happens. We know they actually do end up both advertising. And so game theory tries to explain that. Why do they do what seems counterintuitive? So when you're reading the matrix, it's key to understand that the horizontal player, this one over here, the one who's on the side, is always the left column. Okay, which is kind of makes sense, right? It's kind of intuitive. The vertical player is always the right column, and that becomes a little bit harder for kids to see. Right, the left is to the left, but right is up above. So I think it really helps to color code, at least when kids are first starting. And if you're teaching this in a regular class, which, by the way, kids love this, so I would totally encourage you to use this in whatever class you can. And the activity in the Orange Book really makes it very, very straightforward. But I would color code, because then they don't get as confused, right? So when you're looking at this, what strategies are available to each player, what payoffs will each player receive, and the matrix gives you all of that information. So we'll come back to this one. The prisoner's dilemma is a popular matrix that's a little bit confusing to kids, because when you look at the numbers in the matrix here, it doesn't tell you anything, right? It doesn't give you any like units or whatever. And when you're doing the prisoner's dilemma, the basic, and this story is within that lesson. The basic story is, okay, you have two criminals, and they've committed a crime together, and the police get them and they bring them into the station and they separate them, right? And they tell Chris, okay, we got Pat in the other room and he's about to confess. But if you confess first, then you'll only get 1 year in prison. And that's this corner. Let me get my pen out here. That's this little spot over here. Okay, that's what they're telling Chris. Because if Pat denies, that's the right column. If Pat denies and Chris confesses, we end up in this corner. And the one on the left, remember, is going to be Chris, because he's the player on the left. So we're saying if you confess and he doesn't, you're the first one, you get only 1 year in prison. And so the thing I want to point out here is that here, high numbers are bad. Right? Most of these matrices, or matrices, you are going to see high numbers are good, because they're going to be like profits, or they're going to be revenues. But the prisoner's dilemma, if kids have done this one, or if you've done it, you want the lower numbers. So you just want to remind kids to always be clear on what those numbers represent. So if they represent years in prison, you want them to be low, right? And they tell Pat, if you're the one who confesses first, right here, if you're the one who confesses first and Chris denies, then you're the one who gets the 1 year, right? And Chris will go away for 10 years. So this is that, divide and conquer strategy. What happens? They both confess, right? So we end up here in this corner rather than down here, both deny, which would actually, of course, be more beneficial to them. So why do we end up there? When you're doing game theory analysis, it's really, really important to be able to look at the columns really clearly, sort of separately. So what I like to do is say this. Okay, let's imagine that I am Chris. We're just going to, right now, all we're going to look at is Chris. If I'm Chris, I don't know if Pat's going to confess or deny. I do know that if Pat confesses, okay, if Pat confesses, then I face a choice of confess and get 5 years or deny and get 10. Right? If he confesses, those are my options. Well, 5 looks better, right? So if he's going to confess, I should take 5. But what if he's going to deny? What should I do? If he's going to deny, then I could confess and get 1 or deny and get 2. Again, confess looks like the better deal for me. So we can see that Chris has a dominant strategy, because what if Pat confesses, Chris should confess. If Pat denies, Chris should confess. Either way, Chris should confess. Dominant strategy. Let's look at it from Pat's perspective. Pat's saying, I don't know what Chris is going to do. If Chris confesses, I could confess and get 5 or deny and get 10. I should confess and get 5. If Chris denies, I could confess and get 1 or deny and get 2. I should confess. So they both have a dominant strategy of confess. And that's how we work through this analysis. And so on Monday, if you're not quite clear from listening to me describe this, we can walk through this again. If you look at the Coke Pepsi, I put a little bit more notes on here. Dominant strategy is when the player has the best strategy regardless of which strategy the other player follows. A Nash equilibrium exists if each player has chosen their best strategy and they have no incentive for changing. So it may be actually that one of the players has a dominant strategy and the other does not. But once that situation exists, you can still have a Nash equilibrium because nobody has an incentive for changing. So if you look at this one, again, we can follow this analysis and say, all right, let's see, Pepsi, what should you do? If Coke advertises, you could advertise and get 80. And now remember, numbers are high. We want numbers high because this is going to be profits. So Coke advertises, I should advertise. If Coke doesn't advertise, I should advertise. My dominant strategy is advertise. If I'm Coke, if Pepsi advertises, I could get 80 or 45. 80 looks better. If they don't advertise, 120 or 100, this looks better, right? So they both have a dominant strategy of advertising, and that's why they end up advertising, even though they would have a better outcome if they could collude, right, and agree not to advertise. But such collusive agreements are illegal in the United States and therefore pretty unenforceable. All right, the last part of this lesson is a fun clip from this British game show called Golden Balls, and I'm not going to show it to you here. But if you want to Google it, look for Golden Balls. In this particular episode, you could either put in 100,000 pound split or steel, or you can call it Steve and Sarah. Their names are Steve and Sarah, and I would really, really recommend you watch this. My students absolutely love it. You know, they can't get over it. We usually end up watching a couple other episodes, and then I frequently get emails from them a year or two later when they're in college and they're taking econ, and guess what? Their college professor at, you know, Minnesota or USC or Penn or wherever, they all show this clip. So the kids are like, I've already seen it, I knew it. So it's a lot of fun, and it really helps the kids make sense of it. And it's actually also cited, and it's actually part of the lesson that's in the orange book. And you can kind of reenact it. So there's a little explanation of how you can play split or steel to illustrate game theory as an activity with your students. So that's a wrap up of what we were going to do last week, and hopefully we will not have technology problems this coming week for our final video conference. Thanks for your patience.